The 4% rule does not take into consideration taxes. Research on sustainable withdrawal rates is always continuing, and what we found is that strictly adhering to these rules could lead to underspending and missed opportunities during your lifetime, especially during your most active retirement years. Bill Bengen's kind of the story behind the 4% rule, and I have to say, use air quotes every time I say rule, just because it hurts my feelings, because it's not a rule.
It's not a rule.
It's a guideline. Just because someone's a rocket scientist does not mean that we should take all of their advice, okay? So in today's video, we're going to be examining why the very famous 4% retirement withdrawal rule, maybe should be more like a guideline, could be causing a lot of folks to live far more frugally in their retirement than necessary. We're big on talking about spending and encouraging spending, and we're going to extend that to this video today. And through analyzing real-world retirement spending scenarios from lots of people across the country, one of the things that we found is that folks tend to really struggle with figuring out how much they need to spend. And research on sustainable withdrawal rates is always continuing, and what we found is that strictly adhering to these rules could lead to underspending and missed opportunities during your lifetime, especially during your most active retirement years. And so that's why we're making this video today. We want to show you why a more flexible approach to making withdrawals in retirement might make more sense for you, and what specific factors you should use to determine your optimal withdrawal rate in the long run, so that you can confidently spend more in retirement without sacrificing the security of that withdrawal rate strategy.
All right, let's get into it.
So there's an article that I came across recently that we've attached. It's from Edelman Financial Engines. I don't know why that's always hard for me to say. And they're talking about Bill Bengen's kind of the story behind the 4% rule. And I have to say, use air quotes every time I say rule, just because it hurts my feelings, because it's not a rule.
It's not a rule.
It's a guideline. Mm-hmm. And so we're going to talk a little bit about how it was created, some of the kind of downfalls with the methodology, and how many times it's changed over the years. And so that's really what that article was referencing.
Okay.
And kind of giving some of that background. So Bill Bengen, he was a rocket scientist turned financial advisor. Oh. So you're like, okay, well, that means that he knows everything. You're like, well, hang on, just because someone's a rocket scientist does not mean that we should take all of their advice, okay? And so what he was trying to figure out, this was in the early 90s, he was trying to figure out, what's the optimal portfolio to maintain through retirement to be able to not run out of money. Yeah. This was the question.
Right.
And so what he did is he took data from basically rolling 30-year periods, and he wanted to see what was going to work in all of the scenarios. Sure. With a big asterisk, because some of these scenarios hadn't happened yet. To me, we're starting with somewhat of a flawed premise here. I have to say, yeah. Right? And so up to a certain period of time, there wasn't enough data to be able to do this. Sure. And so we're projecting what we thought was going to happen. Mm-hmm. Well, what actually happened is different than that.
Of course. Yeah.
And so just in terms of the pure methodology, it's very difficult to project over a 30-year time period. Now, we have to rely on some historical data in order to do that, but we also need to go, okay, let's take this with a grain of salt. Yeah. Like, this was meant to be the end-all, be-all. How do we make the right portfolio so it's a set it and forget it? We never have to do. And there's some details that are missing, in my opinion, in order to really make a strong case for that. And so the idea was, if you had roughly a 60-40 portfolio, 60% stock, 40% bonds, intermediate bonds, that if you started at retirement with a 4% withdrawal rate, and then you adjusted that for inflation every year, then you would most likely not run out of money. That leaves a lot on the table to go wrong, mm-hmm. and a lot of real life for people to be experiencing. What we found is that spending is not a straight line in retirement. Right. And if that's the only thing that we can do is just, if that's all we've got, mm-hmm. number one, we're taking a ton of risk, but number two, we're leaving a lot on the table.
Yeah. And we've talked about before, people do a lot of stuff when they first retire because typically they are younger, healthier, and they've been chained to a desk for 40 years, mm-hmm. and they want to go do stuff. Well, going and doing stuff costs money. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of people will spend a lot more money the first probably 10 years of their retirement, but then the last 10 years of their retirement, they don't do much. Their health has declined, their mobility's gone down, and they just don't want to travel as much, and they don't spend hardly any money.
Yeah.
And so if you're planning on spending the same dollars every year, you're going to drastically underspend when you really want to and could, and then accumulate a bunch of money at the end. And I don't think that's what most people want.
And it's not optimal.
Right.
In a certain, and you know, there's never going to be a perfect retirement planning scenario, right? But part of this is we have to talk about, yes, it's easy, but is it useful? Just because there's been a study on it and the guy published it and this is what everyone does, doesn't mean that that's useful. You know, I mean, you can look at a lot of different historical practices that have happened for a long time. You know, just because a doctor said it doesn't mean we should do leeches, right? I mean, you know, like at a certain point, just because this is what's hot and what everyone's doing doesn't mean that we should be doing this. Doesn't mean we shouldn't do further investigation. You know, another thing that's interesting to me, and I appreciate the effort that Bengen put into this to try to figure out a useful tool to be able to determine this, right? Because in the early 90s, when he was trying to figure this out, like people hadn't really retired very long. Like you just worked until you died is pretty much how it worked.
Yeah.
And so, you know, retirement plans, 401ks, IRAs, really no one had begun to even liquidate those at that point. And so think of this as like, this is the Stone Age equivalent of like how we do retirement planning. Sure. Like this was at the beginning of this, just in terms of progressing technologically and philosophically in the industry. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of market history that's happened. There's a lot of technological advancement that's happened. There's a lot of planning that's happened between then and now.
Right, and products.
Products has changed.
A lot of products are different.
Yeah. I mean, Roth IRA and 401ks weren't even invented when this was around. Wow. You know, okay. And so I want to put this in perspective for folks who, you know, like, could it work? Yeah. And, you know, like like walking to work every day could work, and you could ride a horse or a mule, you know, and maybe you want to, and that's fine. But that doesn't mean that that's all we should do. Just because just because our parents did it doesn't mean that that is the way that we should do things. True. And you know, another piece of this that I think not enough folks talk about is the 4% rule does not take into consideration taxes. And you know, the bulk of portfolios in this period that would have been liquidated in that data set ending at, you know, in the early to mid 90s were not IRAs. And so we have a totally different tax system now. And so what happens is, if the amount of money that you need to take out in order to meet your spending level, if your tax rate forces you to make that a higher withdrawal rate, then you have a risk of running out of money faster. This is a snowballing problem. Yeah. If you've got to actually take out 6% in order to cover your taxes to get to a net 4%, you know, inflation adjusted withdrawal, we're not talking about a 4% rule now. We're talking about a 6% rule. Right. But then you've got to take more out to be able to meet your expenses, and this thing snowballs. And so, look, is it a starting point? Sure. Is it the end all be all? We're going to suggest it really shouldn't be. Right. It really shouldn't be where you end. It's a good beginning point, but it really shouldn't be the end point. And to your point, Todd, if that's all we do, we may be leaving some money on the table. Mm-hmm. There are a wide range of probabilities here.
Yeah. And we have tools that can project this with your numbers, with real taxes, and some conservative estimates into the future. But we have software that you just change some numbers and you can literally see the future. Don't rely on a rule, quote, a rule like this or a general guideline. You know, look at your very specific situation, plug your situation in there and what you want to do with it, and we can narrow this down to this is probably what you should do.
And I think that's exactly the way that we need to approach it, is we need to customize it to you. But I think what's also interesting is, this is a cookie cutter approach. We need to customize it to what you actually want to spend. There's a difference between how much, what's the minimum amount I can spend so that I don't run out philosophically, to what could my portfolio actually sustain? And even further than that, what do I want to spend? And how do we figure out a plan to make sure that that works? Right. That's the optimized version of it. And what's interesting, every time, he revises this like every year, by the way. People don't realize that. He's really? Like, oh, actually now this year, like it's this. And it's like 1 year it was like 4.7% because he discovered small cap and micro cap stocks, which have higher volatility but higher expected returns. Yeah. Okay. And he's like, and now it's 4.7%. And then like during COVID, it was like, well, it's like closer to 2% now because there was a big market correction. Wow. And you're like, okay, well, hang on. Like, let's, it's like at a certain point, you're like, all right, maybe we just need to think of a better way to do this, And one of my criticisms, and I've very publicly been critical of him on this, has been that, the idea was, hey, build roughly a 60-40 portfolio. And he's adjusted that over time and just kind of set it and forget it. And all you got to do is just do your withdrawals every year. Like it's easy. This is the easiest retirement plan ever, right? Mm-hmm. And you're like, okay, well, hardly anyone actually does that, number one. Right. And number two, like we have a lot better data about how to invest more thoughtfully. Like we should take that into consideration. We should rebalance the portfolio. We should do tax loss harvesting. We should do some of these other things. But in practice, his thing is like, let's not try to time the market. Let's just maintain the portfolio and run. What's interesting to me, during COVID, there's a Wall Street Journal article on it. We can find it if you want to look at it. He's quoted in the Wall Street Journal in 2020. They're like, hey, what's your portfolio like right now? And he's like, yeah, it's mostly cash and a little bit of bonds. And so his whole thing, the entire thing is built on the premise of how do we not try to time the market? And when it mattered, like when it really mattered,
he timed the market.
He couldn't do it.
Yeah.
He got caught trying to time the market. Wow. And I'm not trying to beat him up. I'm really not. That's not the point. Yeah. But it's interesting. It's interesting when you're approaching retirement and the person who wrote the quote unquote rule about it and said, hey, do this, himself personally cannot do it. And so do you expect, he's a rocket scientist, like, should we expect reasonably that people will not be emotional during these times and actually stick to this? And there's going to be one guy that's like, well, I've done it for 20, like, good for you. Okay. But like, I'm not talking to those people. I'm talking to the hardworking, honest people who, they were an electrician or they were a teacher, they were a doctor. And like, they don't care as much about this stuff. They just want to not worry about it. Mm-hmm. Like, sorry, we got to be thoughtful about who we take advice from. And so there were some interesting points about that in the article, but I think kind of the takeaway here is that should be the baseline. 4% could be the baseline if you maintain the right portfolio and you watch it every time and you adjust for taxes and you have everything right, or you can customize a plan that works for you based on your asset allocations, based on what you want to own, based on what you want to do. And I think that's a more sustainable path in the long run.
Interesting.
It really, really is. Another factor that's important is he was projecting a 30-year retirement. The odds that your retirement is exactly 30 years are very slim.
Sure.
Many folks, if you're a married couple and you make it to 65, 67, actuarial projections are that you're going to make it to 95 or 100.
Mm-hmm. That's 10 more years. Yeah.
Which is, a 30% increase in the amount of time your money has to last, right?
Exactly.
It's an interesting way to frame that, right? Or maybe, you have some health challenges, or, there's different factors, and 30 years is not probably going to be it. Maybe it's going to be 20 years.
Well, I'm reading a book right now that is pretty interesting, and basically he's saying that your generation, it's not going to be unheard of to hear of people living to be 120, 130 years old.
That wouldn't surprise me. Mm-hmm. It terrifies me.
Because the technology is progressing so quickly that they're going to be able to add decades. Maybe not my generation, but yours. It will not be unheard of for someone to live to be 120. Well, that's spending half of your life retired.
Mm-hmm. if you retire it,
If you retire at 60, yeah. I mean, you could literally spend half of your life retired. How does that fit into financial pictures?
Yeah, how does that fit into the 4%
Now
rule?
everybody's like, oh.
But what if your retirement is shorter or longer than 30 years?
Yeah.
How do we adjust for that, or how do we adjust for Social Security claiming strategies? How do we adjust for things like inheritances? This is a really interesting issue, right? Like if you're approaching, let's say you're approaching retirement, and your parents were the people who spent as little as possible and more than they've saved more than they need, and that's going to get sent to the kids. Okay, we don't want to build the retirement plan just assuming that you're going to get an inheritance, but what if you do? And that adjusts those numbers. But what if you get that inheritance later in life than you expect? And you've been delaying spending for a while, and now you have more money at the end. Like, this is a fascinating problem. And so it's gotta be customized. And healthcare costs are going to be different. We haven't even talked about long-term care in this. Long-term care blows everything up on a 4% rule.
That's way more than 4%.
Yeah. That's $10,000 a month right now. And so I think the big picture here is, if you want to really retire successfully, this can be a great starting point, napkin math to figure out, are we on track? But customize this based on the asset location that you have. Where are your assets? Are they in non-qualified, non-IRA accounts, or are they in IRAs? The tax thing throws everything off. And what do you own? What's your risk tolerance? If you don't have a very bland 60-40 portfolio, this is all going to get thrown totally out of whack. There are portfolios based on, how much do I want to say on this? When we stress test portfolios, we can stress test for a much larger withdrawal rate, depending on the asset allocation and your other guaranteed income sources. And if you're leaving money on the table and you could be spending more, when would you want to know that? Would you want to know that when you can't make any adjustments, or when you can adjust and you can have the retirement that you want? Sure. So I think that's some of the truth behind this. So, now that you understand why the 4% rule often leads to unnecessary frugality, not taking everything else into consideration, and it's really a cookie cutter plan, you can approach retirement with a withdrawal strategy that has a lot more flexibility and hopefully provides you more confidence if you plan ahead and you customize it. So if you want a personalized analysis of what you can confidently spend in retirement, click the link in the description, fill out the questionnaire. It's really quick. We will send you a personalized video about how to create a more flexible withdrawal strategy based on your lifestyle, your goals, and your asset allocation. We look forward to seeing you in the next video.